On a freezing winter night in a quiet American parking lot, a wealthy husband believed no one would dare interfere. His wife fell hard onto the wet concrete, her fear swallowed by darkness and silence. What he did not see was a 45-year-old former Navy SEAL watching from the shadows, nor the German Shepherd at his side trained to recognize terror before it becomes bloodshed. One step forward, one low growl, one choice that would shatter a carefully hidden life of abuse. This is not a story about heroism alone. It is about the moment silence breaks and the danger that follows when a victim dares to reach for help. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Wet winter air pressed low over Spokane, Washington's snowmelt, mixing with rain until the ground became a cold, gray slurry beneath flickering sodium lights. Jack Morgan walked slowly across the outdoor parking lot of a suburban shopping center, his boots crunching softly through slush and gravel. At 45, he moved with the deliberate restraint of a man who had learned the cost of wasted motion. His thick, dark brown leather jacket cracked with age and softened by years of wear hung heavy on his broad shoulders. Beneath it, a red and navy flannel shirt was buttoned to the throat, partially hidden by a loosely wrapped gray wool scarf. Faded jeans clung to long, powerful legs, the denim worn pale at the knees and seams. Cold-weather leather boots anchored him to the earth. Jack looked like a man out of another decade, practical, unadorned, and quietly intimidating without ever trying to be. His face was angular and weathered stubble darkening his jaw, eyes steel gray and perpetually alert, shaped by years of scanning for threats that never announced themselves politely. Beside him walked Shadow, a 6-year-old German Shepherd, with a thick sable and black coat that shed water effortlessly. Shadow had once been a working dog, trained for military service, and though retirement had softened none of his instincts, it had given him a deeper calm. His ears rotated constantly, tracking distant car doors, raised voices, the scrape of tires. His amber eyes missed nothing. The leash in Jack's hand was slack, not because Shadow was passive, but because trust between them ran deeper than commands. Jack had come out for nothing more than groceries, a mundane errand his therapist insisted mattered. Ordinary routines, she said, helped men like him relearn how to exist without war. Jack wasn't convinced. Parking lots at night still felt like open kill zones. Too many blind angles. Too many places to disappear. That was when he noticed them. Near the far edge of the lot, under a half-burned light, stood a couple who didn't match the aimless rhythm of shoppers loading bags into trunks. The man was Mark Reynolds, though Jack didn't know his name yet. Mark appeared to be in his late 30s, clean-cut and meticulously groomed. His dark hair was neatly parted, his wool overcoat expensive, his posture upright with the casual confidence of someone used to being deferred to. His face was handsome in a symmetrical, corporate way, but his eyes were cold, calculating, fixed not on the world, but on the woman beside him. That woman was Emily Reynolds, 27, slim to the point of fragility. She wore a long beige coat that swallowed her narrow frame and a scarf looped twice around her neck, despite the relatively mild cold. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a loose knot strands, escaping to frame a pale face that seemed perpetually braced for impact. Her movements were careful, apologetic, as if she were constantly afraid of occupying too much space. Emily dropped her keys. The sound was small, metallic, but it carried. When she bent to retrieve them, Mark leaned in close and whispered something Jack couldn't hear. Emily's shoulders tightened instantly. Her hand trembled as she picked up the keys, her gaze dropping to the pavement. Jack recognized the posture immediately. He had seen it on civilians overseas, on hostages, on people who had learned that eye contact invited punishment. Shadow slowed his body, stiffening. A low sound vibrated in his chest, barely audible but unmistakable. Jack felt it travel up the leash. Easy, Jack murmured, more reflex than instruction. He considered walking away. Couples argued. It wasn't his place. He had promised himself he would stop intervening where he didn't belong. Then the couple moved deeper into the darker section of the lot, away from the storefronts. The sound came fast. A sharp, ugly impact. Emily stumbled and fell hard onto the wet concrete, her palms scraping against gravel. Mark's voice rose harsh and uncontrolled, cutting through the rain. He grabbed her arm, yanking her upright, only to shove her again. He kicked the side of a nearby car, metal ringing as he shouted words thick with rage and entitlement. Jack stepped forward into the light. Shadow surged ahead, placing himself squarely between Emily and Mark, his body a wall of muscle and teeth. His lips curled slightly, not in attack, but in warning, a deep growl rolling from him like thunder held in check. Mark spun, startled, his anger redirecting instantly. "Get your dog under control," he snapped, voice sharp with superiority. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me," Jack said calmly. His voice was low, steady, carrying no threat, yet full of it. He moved with precision, closing the distance in seconds. When Mark lunged in frustration, Jack caught his wrist twisted and turned him face first against the car. No punches, no wasted force, just leverage and control. Mark gasped, shock replacing fury as he realized how helpless he was. Red and blue lights washed over the lot moments later. Officer Brian Cole arrived first, a stocky man in his early 40s with tired eyes and a weathered face that suggested long shifts and little sleep. Close behind him was Officer Hannah Lewis, late 20s, sharp-eyed, her movements efficient and alert. They separated the parties quickly. Shadow sat at Jack's heel without command, eyes locked on Mark. Emily stood shaking, arms wrapped around herself. Officer Lewis spoke gently, asking questions, scanning for injuries. Mark adjusted his coat, adopting a wounded dignity that felt practiced. "I slipped," Emily said finally, her voice barely above the rain. She did not look at Jack. It was an accident. He misunderstood. Jack felt something sink inside his chest. He saw the calculation in her face, the math of survival playing out behind her eyes. Mark said nothing, only watched her with a faint, satisfied calm. Without a complaint, there was nothing the officers could hold. Mark was released with a warning. As he guided Emily toward their car, his hand pressed firmly into the small of her back, not protective, but possessive. As they passed, Jack reached out briefly, pressing a small folded piece of paper into Emily's palm. "Call me." "Anytime," he said quietly. Her fingers closed around it. She did not look back. Jack stood beneath the rain as their car disappeared into the night. Shadow stared after it, ears forward, unmoving. Jack wondered, not for the first time, whether stepping in had saved someone or merely marked the beginning of something far worse. The Reynolds house in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, sat beneath a colorless winter sky, the lake wind pressing cold against its walls, the quiet inside so complete it felt engineered rather than peaceful. From the outside, the home looked immaculate, wide windows, pale stone, siding a driveway swept clean even after snowfall. Inside, the silence had weight. Mark Reynolds no longer struck Emily where anyone could see. He had learned. Bruises healed, but fear lingered longer when there were no marks to explain it. At 38, Mark carried himself with the controlled polish of a financial advisor accustomed to boardrooms and authority. His jaw was clean-shaven, his hair precisely cut, his voice calm when others listened. In private, that calm hardened into something colder. He controlled the accounts, the passwords, the schedules. Emily's phone buzzed only when he allowed it to. He reviewed statements nightly, asked where she had been, why she needed money, who she spoke to. His threats were never shouted. They were whispered, surgical delivered, when his mouth was close to her ear, and his hand rested lightly on her shoulder, like a promise that could become a warning. Emily moved through the house like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. At 27, she was slender and soft-spoken, her auburn hair often tied back, as if to avoid drawing attention to herself. Her skin carried a permanent pallor, not from illness, but from the constant tension that never allowed full rest. She cleaned rooms that were already spotless, folded towels that had never been used, learned the creak of every stair and door. At night, she slept on the edge of the bed, alert to shifts in Mark's breathing. Fear had trained her body better than any alarm system. The only person who knew something was wrong was her sister. Rachel Miller lived in Bozeman, Montana, 32 years old, practical, with sharp eyes, and an easy laugh that used to fill Emily's childhood. Rachel was taller, broader, shouldered, her brown hair cut blunt at the jaw, her personality defined by directness and stubborn loyalty. She had asked questions before. Emily had deflected them, but the silence had grown too loud. Emily wrote the email late one afternoon, fingers trembling as she typed on the laptop Mark rarely checked. She chose her words carefully, avoiding accusations disguising fear as exhaustion. "I'm tired all the time. I don't feel safe. I don't know how to leave." She sent it quickly, then deleted the draft history, her heart pounding as if she had run miles. For a few hours, she felt lighter. That evening, Mark came home smelling of whiskey and cold air. He was quieter than usual. His movements measured his eyes, scanning the house with unsettling focus. He sat at the dining table scrolling through his phone, then looked up slowly. "You've been emailing a lot today," he said, tone conversational. Emily's breath caught. He showed her the screen. Rachel's name glowed back at her. Mark's mouth curved into a thin smile. The house changed instantly. He stood sweeping his arm across the counter, sending a glass crashing to the floor. The sound echoed violently. He moved through the rooms with sudden purpose, pulling drawers open, overturning a chair, his anger no longer restrained. Emily retreated, her instincts screaming. She locked herself in the bathroom, the only room with a solid door. From behind the door, she heard metal slide. The safe. Her blood ran cold. Mark's voice drifted down the hallway, thick with alcohol and fury. "You think you can plan behind my back?" he shouted. "You think anyone's coming to save you?" Emily crouched beside the bathtub, hands shaking so badly she struggled to unlock her phone. Her reflection in the mirror barely looked human. Eyes wide, lips, colorless, shoulders curled inward. She remembered the paper in her coat pocket, worn soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times. She dialed the number. Jack Morgan answered on the second ring. At 45, Jack lived alone outside Spokane, his days divided between quiet routines and long stretches of listening to nothing but wind and memory. His voice was steady when he spoke, low and controlled, shaped by years of command and restraint. "Jack," he said simply. Emily whispered his name, as if speaking too loudly might summon Mark. Her words came in fragments, breathless terror threading every syllable. Jack listened without interrupting his mind, already shifting the past, rising like a familiar tide. He could hear the crash of another object in the background, the slur in Mark's voice, the thin wall between survival and catastrophe. "Where are you?" Jack asked. He kept his tone calm, authoritative, the way he had once spoken to men pinned down under fire. Emily told him. Jack pictured the house, the layout forming instinctively in his mind. He imagined Mark's hands, the weight of the weapon, the narrowing options. Shadow rose from his place near the door, sensing the change in Jack's posture. At 6, the German Shepherd still carried the solid strength of his working years, his ears' forward muscles tightening. Jack grabbed his jacket, the familiar worn leather heavy across his shoulders. The flannel beneath felt like armor. He did not tell Emily he was coming. He told her to stay quiet, to lock the door, to get low. His words were firm, not comforting, because comfort was a luxury time did not allow. As Jack moved toward the door, his thoughts cut inward. He remembered the parking lot, the way Emily had closed her hand around the paper, the look in her eyes when she walked away. He wondered if intervening had accelerated this moment. He wondered if hesitation would have killed her. The questions were useless now. In the bathroom, Emily pressed the phone to her chest as Mark's footsteps approached, heavy and unsteady. The door handle rattled once. Then again. She closed her eyes, clinging to the sound of Jack's voice, still echoing in her ear, to the idea that somewhere someone had heard her. Snow lashed sideways across the highway as night swallowed eastern Washington headlights, carving narrow tunnels through white chaos and wind. Jack Morgan drove with both hands steady on the wheel, his jaw-set eyes unblinking as the storm battered his truck. The wipers struggled to keep pace, ice collecting faster than they could clear it. At 45, Jack had driven through worse mountain passes under fire desert roads, seeded with explosives. But this felt different. This was not a mission sanctioned by command. This was a choice. Shadow sat rigid in the passenger seat, 6 years old, broad-chested, his thick German Shepherd coat, dusted with snow, each time Jack opened the door at gas stops. The dog's amber eyes stayed forward, reading the night, sensing the urgency vibrating through Jack's body. Jack replayed Emily Reynolds' voice in his mind, the way it had thinned into something almost childlike when she whispered that Mark had opened the safe. Fear like that didn't fade. It escalated. Jack knew the pattern too well. Mark Reynolds would not calm down. He would not sleep it off. Men like Mark didn't explode once and feel remorse. They refined their control. By the time Jack reached Coeur d'Alene, the storm had intensified. Snow piled against curbs, wind howled off the lake, and the neighborhood where the Reynolds house sat looked abandoned, lights dimmed against the weather. Jack parked 2 houses down, engine off breath, fogging the cab. He pulled on his worn, dark brown leather jacket, the red and navy flannel beneath tight against his chest, gray scarf tucked in. Shadow followed him silently, paws sinking into snow without a sound. Inside the Reynolds house, the air was hot and sharp with alcohol and shattered glass. Mark Reynolds stood in the living room, shirt sleeves rolled, tie discarded, his face flushed, eyes glassy with rage. At 38, he was still well-built, his clean lines distorted now by fury and entitlement. The handgun rested heavy in his grip metal, catching the overhead light as he paced. He had always believed control was intelligence, that fear was obedience. Tonight, that belief cracked. Emily was locked in the bathroom, crouched beside the tub, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her phone lay pressed against her chest, Jack's voice a lifeline already gone quiet. Her breathing came in shallow bursts. Every sound outside the door made her flinch, the scrape of shoes, the clink of metal, the low murmur of Mark's voice as he argued with himself. She was 27. But terror-erased years reduced her to instinct alone. The confrontation erupted fast. Jack moved through the back entrance glass, crunching under his boots. Mark spun gun-lifting on reflex. Shadow lunged before the shot could line up. The German Shepherd crossed the room in a blur of muscle and teeth, his jaws clamping down on Mark's forearm with trained precision. The gun discharged, once the sound deafening in the enclosed space, the bullet burying itself harmlessly into drywall. Mark screamed pain and shock, shattering his dominance. Jack was on him immediately. He struck the gun away, twisted Mark's wrist until the weapon fell, then drove him face first into the floor, his knee between Mark's shoulders, his weight pinning him without mercy. Jack's face was calm, almost distant, his breath controlled as if this were muscle memory rather than violence. "Don't move," he said quietly, the words carrying more authority than a shout ever could. Police arrived minutes later, lights bleeding red and blue through snow-streaked windows. Emily was escorted out wrapped in a blanket, shaking but alive. Shadow sat at Jack's side, blood from Mark's arm staining his muzzle, his posture protective, unyielding. Statements were taken, evidence collected. Mark was cuffed and taken away, still shouting, still convinced this would not end him. By morning, Jack learned how right Mark was. Thomas Hale arrived at the station before the coffee cooled. At 55, Hale was lean, gray-haired, his face etched with practiced composure. He wore a tailored coat and spoke softly, efficiently, his voice designed to calm systems and redirect blame. He had built his reputation on extracting men like Mark from consequences, leveraging technicalities and influence. Hale did not argue facts. He reframed them. Alcohol impairment, emotional distress, excessive response by a civilian. Within hours, Mark Reynolds was out on bail, his arm bandaged, his expression colder than before. Emily watched from a bench as Mark walked past her under Hale's guidance. Mark didn't speak. He smiled. It was small, private, and full of promise. Emily's knees weakened. Jack saw it. He saw the calculation behind Mark's eyes and understood immediately that this was not over. Jack didn't wait for instructions. He packed what little he needed and drove Emily north, away from town, away from familiar roads. The cabin near Colville National Forest was old, timber-framed, half-hidden among pines, heavy with snow. It had belonged to a friend, once a man Jack had buried years ago. The place smelled of wood smoke and cold earth. It wasn't comfortable, but it was defensible. Shadow claimed the threshold instantly, lying just inside the door, head up, ears tuned to the forest. Emily sat by the fire, wrapped in borrowed clothes, her face still pale, eyes tracking every sound. Jack moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, checking locks, clearing sight lines, setting routines without explaining them. He didn't need to. Emily understood instinctively that safety here was provisional. That night, as wind rattled the walls and snow piled higher, Jack stood on the porch, scarf pulled tight, scanning the tree line. He felt the familiar pull of vigilance settle into his bones. Mark Reynolds had money pride and a lawyer who specialized in erasing boundaries. Men like that did not accept loss. They redefined it. Jack rested a hand on Shadow's head, the dog's warmth solid beneath his palm. He knew the truth now with cold certainty. This chapter had only begun. Night settled hard over the Colville forest, snow drifting down in thick, soundless sheets as wind threaded through the pines like a warning whispered too late. The cabin crouched beneath the trees, its timber walls dark against the white ground, smoke barely visible from the chimney. Inside, Jack Morgan sat at the small wooden table, boots, planted shoulders squared beneath his worn, dark brown leather jacket. The red and navy flannel beneath it was buttoned tight, his gray scarf still looped at his neck, as if he had never truly come inside. At 45, Jack's face looked carved from fatigue and restraint, sharp cheekbones, deep-set gray eyes, stubble shadowing his jaw. He had the stillness of a man who had survived long enough to know stillness was never safety. Emily Reynolds sat across the room, near the fire, knees drawn up beneath a thick blanket. The flames painted her pale face in warm flickers that never quite reached her eyes. She had begun to breathe more easily here, but the fear had not left her body. It lived in the way her fingers twitched at every sound, in the way she flinched when the cabin creaked. Shadow lay at the door, 6 years old, massive shoulders rising and falling slowly, ears alert even in rest. His amber eyes tracked the darkness beyond the threshold, reading what humans could not. Jack felt it first, the shift. The forest went quiet. No wind through branches, no distant animal calls. Silence like that had meant danger in places far from Idaho. He rose without a word, moving to the window, parting the curtain just enough to look out. Snow blurred the distance, but he saw movement where there should have been none. Victor Kane stepped from behind a tree boots, crunching softly. At 41, Kane was tall and thick-necked, his shaved head glistening with snow. His face bore old scars that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer, his eyes flat and unreadable. He wore dark tactical clothing movements, efficient, practiced. Kane had once sold his skills wherever money flowed, years of violence shaping him into a man who felt nothing when pulling a trigger. Behind him followed Luke Harris, 29, lean and jittery, his beard, uneven eyes darting constantly. Luke was no professional. He was muscle for hire, eager to please, eager to prove himself. Mark Reynolds had paid well. Jack turned, raising a finger to his lips. Emily nodded, clutching the blanket tighter, understanding without explanation. Shadow was already on his feet, body rigid, a low growl vibrating through his chest. Jack eased the back door open, cold air slicing in, and slipped out into the snow. Shadow gliding beside him like a shadow made flesh. The first shot came fast. Glass shattered at the front window as Luke fired blindly, panic fueling his movements. Kane didn't rush. He circled eyes, scanning, reading the terrain. Jack moved, low boots, silent, snow-absorbing sound. He felt the familiar narrowing of focus, the past rising unbidden. He hated how natural it felt. Fire followed. Luke hurled a bottle against the cabin wall, flames blooming instantly, licking hungrily at old wood. Heat rolled through the night-orange light, tearing through the dark. Emily screamed inside. Jack's chest tightened. He broke cover, tackling Luke from the side, driving him into the snow. Luke swung wildly, desperation replacing bravado, but Shadow was there in a blur, jaws snapping inches from Luke's throat, pinning him with ferocious precision. Luke froze, sobbing terror collapsing him into obedience. Kane moved then, calm as a machine. He advanced toward the cabin weapon, raised, intent clear. Jack intercepted him, the impact bone-jarring. They crashed into the snow, Kane strong and ruthless, Jack older but relentless. Kane grunted surprise, flashing briefly as Jack twisted, using leverage rather than strength. A gunshot cracked the bullet, tearing bark from a nearby tree. Shadow lunged again, this time at Kane, forcing him back just long enough. Jack struck Kane's wrist, the weapon falling into the snow, disappearing beneath white. The fire spread, roaring, now flames climbing the cabin's side. Jack broke free, sprinting toward the door. Smoke poured inside, thick and choking. He found Emily curled near the floor, eyes wide, coughing. He wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, pulling her close, his voice steady in her ear, as he guided her through the heat and noise. Shadow followed, positioning himself between them and the chaos, barking furiously to keep Kane at bay. Sirens cut through the night, distant but closing fast. Someone, Luke perhaps, or a neighbor miles away, had called it in. Kane staggered back, eyes calculating, weighing escape against capture. Red and blue lights began to wash the trees. Kane turned and ran, vanishing into the forest, leaving Luke whimpering in the snow under Shadow's watchful stare. Federal agents arrived alongside local law enforcement, their presence unmistakable. Among them was Agent Daniel Foster, early 50s, broad-shouldered silver hair, cropped short eyes, sharp with intelligence rather than anger. He listened as Jack spoke, absorbing details, his expression tightening when Jack mentioned Mark Reynolds by name. Foster nodded once. "We've been tracking him," he said. "This changes everything." Emily sat wrapped in a thermal blanket, shaking but alive, as agents photographed the scene, documenting the fire, the weapons Luke's confession spilling out in panicked fragments. The evidence lay undeniable in the snow and ash. Mark Reynolds had crossed a line he could not buy his way back from. Attempted murder, conspiracy, assault on a former Navy SEAL, federal charges. Jack stood apart, smoke clinging to his jacket, shadow pressed against his leg. Relief did not come. Only a quiet certainty that something had finally ended, even as the forest smoldered behind them. Spring arrived quietly in Bozeman, Montana, sunlight thinning the last traces of winter and warming streets that still remembered snow. The gallery occupied a renovated brick storefront near the old railroad spur, its tall windows catching the afternoon light and scattering it across white walls. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paint and pine cleaner, a calm that felt earned rather than staged. Emily Reynolds stood near the center of the room, hands folded loosely at her waist, her posture different now, upright, balanced, present. At 27, she still carried the slender frame and pale complexion that months of fear had etched into her, but her auburn hair fell freely over her shoulders, no longer tied back in restraint. Her eyes, once perpetually lowered, met those of visitors without apology. She wore a simple charcoal dress, practical, and unadorned, a choice that reflected not modesty, but ownership of herself. The exhibition was titled Still Standing. It wasn't large. Emily had never wanted spectacle. The paintings lined the walls in quiet sequence forests, shadows light breaking through trees, figures half seen and then revealed. The centerpiece hung at the far end, commanding without demanding attention. In it, a man stood in a snow-covered forest, wearing a dark brown leather jacket, a red and navy flannel visible beneath a gray scarf trailing in the cold air. Beside him stood a German shepherd, broad and steady, amber eyes alert. They were not advancing, not retreating. They were simply there, forming a line between darkness and what lay behind them. Viewers lingered, sensing something protective, without fully understanding why. Emily watched them watch the painting. She listened to their murmured interpretations and smiled softly, not to correct them, but to let them have their own meanings. For her, the image held a truth she had only recently learned to name. Jack Morgan arrived late, as he always did. At 45, he had never learned how to enter rooms without scanning them first. His dark brown leather jacket bore fresh creases from travel, the red and navy flannel beneath, buttoned, neatly gray scarf tucked in against the Montana chill. His faded jeans and cold-weather boots marked him as someone passing through rather than settling in. His face looked the same, angular, stubbled eyes, steel gray, but the constant tension that once lived in his shoulders had eased, if only slightly. Shadow walked at his side, 6 years old, now coat gleaming, movements calm and measured. The dog paused at the threshold, assessing, then followed Jack in tail, low alert, but relaxed. Jack stopped in front of the centerpiece without speaking. He studied it with the careful attention of someone used to reading terrain. He saw the details Emily had captured, the way the man's stance suggested readiness without aggression, the way the dog's body angled outward, as if to shield something unseen. He felt a flicker of discomfort, then acceptance. He had never wanted to be a symbol, but he understood why she needed one. Emily noticed him from across the room. Her breath caught, then steadied. She crossed the space slowly, not rushing, not hesitating. "You came," she said. Her voice was clear, stronger than he remembered. "I was nearby, Jack," replied the familiar understatement. He nodded toward the painting. "It's honest." Emily smiled. It had to be. She stood beside him, not too close, not too far. Shadow glanced up at her, recognizing, then settled at Jack's heel. They spoke little. They didn't need to recount what had happened. The past sat between them like a closed book, still present, no longer bleeding. Jack told her he was leaving town that night, heading south, then west. He didn't say where. He never did. Emily nodded, absorbing the news without panic. "I used to think being saved meant being carried out," she said after a moment, eyes fixed on the painting. "Taken somewhere safe and hidden." She turned to him, then meeting his gaze fully. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Jack shook his head once. "No. I wasn't rescued," Emily continued quietly. "I stood up. I walked out. You just stood guard long enough for me to remember how." Jack felt something loosen in his chest. He nodded, accepting the truth she offered without trying to diminish it. That had always been his hope, even if he'd never said it aloud. Shadow shifted, watching Emily for a moment before turning back to Jack, his loyalty uncomplicated and complete. Jack reached down, resting a hand briefly on the dog's head, grounding himself in the familiar solidity. They walked outside together as the gallery lights dimmed behind them. The evening air was cool, clean, carrying the promise of summer. Jack paused beside his truck, the engine already cooling beneath the hood. He didn't reach for Emily, didn't offer a promise he couldn't keep. He simply met her eyes, one last time. "Keep standing," he said. "I will," Emily replied. Jack climbed into the driver's seat. Shadow leapt up beside him, settling with a soft huff. The truck pulled away, tires humming against asphalt taillights, disappearing down the street. Jack did not look back. He focused on the road ahead, on the simple truth that some doors were meant to be guarded, not walked through. Emily remained on the sidewalk for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the gallery, head-high steps steady. She was no longer waiting for rescue. She was living. At the end of this story, the true miracle is not strength, speed, or even rescue. The miracle is that God still places light in the path of those who believe they are invisible. Sometimes that light arrives as courage. Sometimes as a stranger who refuses to look away. And sometimes as the quiet voice inside you that says, "Stand up. Live." God does not always remove the storm immediately, but He gives us what we need to walk through it: wisdom, protection, and the people who stand guard when our strength runs thin. In everyday life, this story reminds us to pay attention, to act when conscience stirs, and to trust that no cry for help is unheard by heaven. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and redemption. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, heal hidden wounds, and give you the strength to stand after every storm.